Hi, I'm Daralene Jones, and welcome to FAMU Law School's Legal Connections. Today, we'll be going into an in-depth conversation to talk about the Ocoee Massacre. 100 years later, we'll be talking to the Dean of the Law School here and Professor Purnell as they give us their reaction to it and the similarities to what we see happening in our country today and the progress they believe still needs to be made. Hello and welcome to FAMU Law's Legal Connections. I'm Daralene Jones, and today we'll be exploring the topic of the Ocoee Massacre of 1920. And we are joined by FAMU Law Dean Deidre Keller. And did I get that correct? Deidre Keller, okay. New to the area, but I know that you have fully immersed yourself and had an opportunity to watch the Ocoee Massacre documentary. I want to first start off by getting your reaction to what you saw explored there.
Absolutely. So I didn't know anything about the massacre before I moved here in mid-June. And I actually live in Ocoee. So it was one of our fantastic colleagues here at the College of Law, Patricia Broussard, who asked, "Where are you living in town?" And I said Ocoee, and she said, "Oh, do you know about the Ocoee Massacre?" And I did not. And so I really have learned a lot and learned a lot more from the documentary. And really the impression that it left me with is really about how much violence has surrounded elections and the exercise of the right to vote for African Americans and other minorities over the course of our history, right? And so to be thinking about that history as we went through another election where voter suppression was again in play was really very sobering.
It really is interesting considering the timing and it being the 100th remembrance of the massacre and the parallels that can be drawn from what we're experiencing in our country today.
Yeah, absolutely. So, it took 45 years from the Ocoee Massacre for the federal legislation protecting the right to vote, right? So we got the Voter Rights Act in 1965. And all of this time later, these are still issues that we are encountering, whether it's, long lines at polls, voter ID requirements, claims of fraud after the fact. These tactics have evolved, but they remain, certainly.
You researched the death, really the murder of Emmett Till, which I'm quite familiar with, especially being from the Chicago area. And so we grew up learning about Mr. Till and the horrific atrocities surrounding his murder. What similarities do you draw from that?
Right. The similarities there are really about the type of violence that we're talking about. In both instances, mobs really were in play, right? So July Perry and the victims of the massacre, July Perry is, of course, the most famous, but not the only victim of the Ocoee Massacre, were hunted, right, by mobs. And very much the same story in Emmett Till's case. Several people showed up at his uncle's house and dragged a 15-year-old child out of his bed, right? And so that mob violence, I think, is the primary similarity. But I also think that the effects of these incidents of mob violence on the communities, there are some similarities there as well, right? So Emmett Till's murder really played a pivotal role in the civil rights movement, right? It was impactful, not just for his family and surrounding community, but really for African Americans all over the country. And that was a direct result of Mamie Till's decision to have her son's casket be open. And the Ocoee Massacre, the effects of that lasted long into almost into the 21st century when you think about it. One of the things that I learned from the documentary was how long it was that African Americans didn't go to Ocoee didn't move to Ocoee, didn't live in Ocoee, right? Just from the memory of the massacre. And even if people didn't know why, their families, their parents warned them away from Ocoee, and certainly warned them away from Ocoee after dark. And so what the similarity there is really that how these incidents of mob violence affect so many more people than just the immediate victims.
Certainly over the past 100 years, we have seen progress in social justice. What progress do you think we've made, but what more do you think still needs to be done?
So, of course, we've made tons of progress. As I said, the mob violence, at least, doesn't exist in the same way that it did. Certainly not backed by law enforcement, which we know in the case of the Ocoee Massacre, it was. And in Emmett Till's case, it was as well. And so that has changed, which I think that's a huge improvement. And I think, when we look at how many African Americans really do exercise the right to vote, we have come a long way from 1920, right? In the early 1900s, 5% of African Americans were voting, and we are in a far better place today. And we saw historic voter turnout in this last election, which is all of that is fantastic progress. There is still work to be done, of course, around social justice. And this summer has highlighted that, right? So we continue to see the killings of Black people, whether by law enforcement or vigilantes. That continues to happen. And the consequences of that, as with the Ocoee Massacre, don't just redound to that person or their family, right? There are longer lasting consequences.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point you bring up. It's not just dealing with it in that moment, but it's the longevity of it all. And I think that's truly what we found in the Ocoee Massacre, is just the longevity of how long the residual effects sort of stick around. Indeed.
Right. Absolutely. And so the issue around George Floyd, for example, the trust between communities of color and law enforcement, that's an issue that is going to be with us for a long time, right? It has been with us for a long time, and it's going to be with us for a long time. I know communities are working towards reforms that can aid in building that trust, but it's going to take a while to do that.
People think it just starts with the George Floyd, but the effect has been there for decades, right, for a century.
Absolutely. That's sort of what is troubling, right? Is you can draw a direct line from Emmett Till to George Floyd.
Thank you so much for your insight, Dean Keller. We'll be right back after this.
When the bell tolls, who will answer the call for justice? Who will own the responsibility of molding those to be socially responsible? What if there was a law school that not only taught social justice, but it became a way of life, where families are the cornerstone of the community and the accused are innocent until proven guilty, and where social matters matter and are handled with swift justice? From the rattle to the gavel, we are Rattlers for Justice. We are Florida A&M University College of Law.
Hi, I'm Daralene Jones, and welcome back. We're now joined by Professor Leroy Purnell. Professor Purnell, talk to us a little bit about your reaction to the Ocoee Massacre and your concerns as you watch history unfold and knowing that's part of Central Florida's history.
Well, I mean, obviously it's shock and horror to understand what has happened, but My biggest reaction is the chilling feeling that this isn't over with. That as we look at, I think the Ocoee Massacre is, one, needs to be viewed in the context of other things that were going on. Within 7 months, we have another major massacre in Oklahoma. And with the Ocoee Massacre, and in particular its relationship to voting, an attempt to suppress voting rights, there are lessons there that we still need to learn about the importance of voting and the importance of being vigilant concerning those who would want to suppress voting and to use that suppression to accomplish other impermissible goals. We consider loss of property as well as the loss of lives, the damage to a community. Those are all omens of things that have played out in the 100 years since.
I was thinking about this recently. You think about it like this: there are unaccounted for deaths.
Yes.
How chilling is that?
It's very chilling. It is disturbing. Particularly in a sense with the Ocoee Massacre, that there has never been a sanctioned full governmental investigation as to what happened and who is responsible for it. That type of intensive investigation would give us much better idea of the lives lost, the impact, and again, those folks who were responsible for that. There have been other major turning points in the history of this country where you have engaged in those types of investigations. The Ocoee Massacre, we have not.
It gives you an idea of the lack of concern for human life.
The lack of concern, and again, failure to recognize the significance of knowing what happened as far as what we do today about how we relate to communities, how we relate to voting rights, and how we relate to some sense of justice.
Speaking of justice, think about this from the context of the Constitution. As you watch and you watch what has unfolded in Ocoee 100 years ago, how does that correlate to the rights that were violated, the laws that were broken?
Well, you start with the simple, most basic. You don't need the Constitution for this. It's murder. Okay, so we have murders that were not, with murderers that were never brought to justice. Now, we go from that and we look at the motivations behind those murders, the suppression of voting. That is a critical attack on the Constitution, on the rights of voting, and to me it's particularly chilling when we think about the attempts to sort of dismantle the 1965 Voting Rights Act and the things we have seen in more recent years in terms of Supreme Court approval of weakening of the Voting Rights Act. I think the Ocoee Massacre tells us is a cautionary warning about the importance of preserving the constitutional right to vote, the legal right to vote, and recognizing that, yes, those things will be suppressed. There are people who will try to keep individuals from exercising their voting rights. And that is a constitutional and societal challenge that in this year of presidential elections, we face those same questions and those same concerns.
In your opinion, is there anything that can be done to make those who were impacted or their descendants whole? And what does that look like?
Well, I think there are a couple of things that can be done. I mean, first and foremost, there's never been a comprehensive attempt to determine what can be done. And this goes, this falls in line with what I mentioned earlier of a failure to ever have a formalized investigation. Secondly, I think that it would be important for not only the survivors, but for communities in general to institute some form of accountability, at least in determining who was responsible. I mean, it's not just a matter of individual persons who committed these crimes. We had persons that represented institutions such as law enforcement involved. And we need to know about that. And we need to know about accountability of those individuals. And then I think we need to think seriously, not just about how we study this in history and not just whether or not we name a day for it. I think what we need to be able to do is look at the survivors, look at the descendants, and look at what the community has lost in all those cases. And there are mechanisms that can be employed to have some type of remedy for those losses. We had, it's no secret that one of the things that happened out of the Ocoee Massacre was, in addition to the loss of life, property was taken. We had a vibrant African-American community that was dismantled and its economic resources scattered, and African-Americans basically thrown out of that city for a very long time, 60, 70 years before folks could move back in. And so when we talk about reparations and we talk about tracing those who were injured, we can do that with some sense of accomplishment if we were to look at how you attempt to make those individuals whole. You know, we did this as a nation not too long ago when we recognized the wrongs that were done to Japanese Americans in America's internment camps. And efforts were made to have some type of reparations for that. We can do that for Ocoee. We can do that for the folks who lost their homes, their lives, their relatives, their loved ones. And it takes the collective will of the people and our governmental institutions to do that.
Yeah, and as we know, our local Senator Randolph Bracy, he put forth an effort to try to pursue reparations for those families, and his measure was dead on arrival in the Florida legislature. We do know that he is going to pursue that measure again in the upcoming spring session, and so we look forward to following that process. Thank you so much, Professor Purnell, for joining us here today for FAMU Law's Connections, and thank you all for joining us. There is so much more to unpack about the Ocoee Massacre. If you would like to get more information, our local ABC affiliate, WFTV, has put together a comprehensive website where you can not only get more written material, but you can also watch the documentary in full, Ocoee Massacre. Just go to WFTV.com/Ocoee. Thanks for joining us. I'm Daralene Jones.